Дорогие коллеги, добрый вечер. Позвольте вас, во-первых, приветствовать после длинного пандемического перерыва в работе нашего семинара. Мы теперь надеемся, что все будет хорошо, и мы будем с вами встречаться регулярно. Сегодня первый семинар после этого длинного перерыва, но он продолжает серию семинаров, начатых в 2019 году и прерванных пандемией возможности исследования сознания. And I am extremely honored to have as a speaker at our seminar today Professor Georg Nordhoff, or Georg Nordthoff, which will be a proper German pronunciation of his name, because Georg is originally from Germany, and he represents the several disciplines which are exactly the match which would be important and necessary for this series of seminars on the approaches to the study of consciousness. He had a medical degree, and he was qualified and specialized in psychiatry. So the study of pathology of conscious subjective mental states, the direct door into perception of what is going on in our brain. He then got 2 PhD degrees, one in neuroscience and second in philosophy. And these three parts of the triangle form a unique expertise of Georg, because he has made a tremendous contribution to the understanding of the global organization of brain states, rested brain states, encoding in the nervous system, and processes of subjective experience and consciousness. He is a prolific author in both neuroscience and cognition and cognitive neuroscience. He has published several books. The recent one is from 2018. There were 2 volumes on the brain in 2013 and few previous books. I welcome to examine these books because they represent an unusual and not traditional, but in many respects the future, I believe, approach to the understanding of what the brain is doing. Georg will give a seminar today, and he will also make a public lecture on Saturday at noontime at the Festival of Science at the Fundamental Library of Moscow State University, 400 yards from here. I'm very grateful for Georg for agreeing to give this talk. We shared before the seminar some of our approaches in Russian neuroscience and his own approach, and we see that there is plenty of things we have to discuss, so I'm looking forward to this lecture. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and also thank you very much for this opportunity. And I can also say I'm really happy to be here. And I'm also very happy about the discussion we had, because first I learned more about the functional systems, and second I learned that there's much more convergence, as he already said, between our approach. Meaning, I think we can learn a lot from each other. And of course, I'm also happy that's what I consider in my manic moments, that this could be the future. In my depressed moments, I think it's all bullshit. So you know how it is as a researcher. So I want to present you today sort of the scientific version of a particular approach to consciousness. And in the public talk, I will go a little bit into that. I will probably explain some things in more detail for the public talk if you don't catch everything. But I will also focus on other mental features, psychiatric disorders, and self in the public talk. So there's some overlap with respect to consciousness, but let's see. So today we developed this temporal-spatial theory of consciousness, bridging the gap between neuronal and mental activity. That's already a program. And really the key question for me is what I formulated down there. How can such a, Arthur Schopenhauer, German philosopher in the 19th century, spoke of a pulpy device, gray pulpy device, I added the gruesome. How can such a device yield consciousness and other mental features like self? So meaning I'm raising the question for how neuronal activity transforms into mental activity. So just for philosophers among you, that question is already a departure from the current approach, because they look for neural correlates. I look for neural transformation. So that's a very important starting point. I don't go into details about this. So what I think one of the main problems is in current neuroscience, I'm not allowed to walk because YouTube forbids me, so I stay here. Okay, yeah, remind me. So what we really do, you know, this picture is very famous. Consciousness, thank you. Consciousness just represents 5% of our mental activity. And the rest is 95% obviously is unconscious. That goes back to Freud, but I think it's really true. Yeah, Marcus Reckle has picked that up, sort of that there's a deeper level to the brain than the cognitive activity. However, even he himself, Marcus Reckle, the founder of the default mode network, is a lonely figure there. It's unbelievable. These cognitive people is just okay. So the question is, my talk is about this one. How can we reach this deeper layer? And what is this? So meaning you will not hear the typical cognitive, affective, special social functions from me. You will see a deeper layer, a deeper, more fundamental layer, which I assume to be key for mental features, in this case, consciousness. Why? When you look in the last 10, 20 years, there have been 20 years ago consciousness and attention. Yeah, our consciousness, attention, special subsets. Consciousness, working memory. There's still Kastner, Graziano, the social attention theory of consciousness. They still say it's attention or cognitive theory. Higher order thought theory, David Rosenthal, Hakam Lau, also typical higher order cognitive thought. That's basically Descartes plotted into the brain. Global neuronal workspace theory, Dehaene, same thing. It's a very cognitive, ultimately, theory. So the question is, and it's clear that mental features, sense of self-consciousness, are not cognitive features. They're simply not. It's clear. Yeah? And when I mean by consciousness, I mean subjective experience. So you might say here, oh, this is not, of course, he's talking. It's boring. So you have a sense of feeling of boredom. I want to explain that feeling. So, and for that, I think we need to reach towards a deeper layer. So my talk will have three main parts. First, I need to sketch a little bit the theoretical background, because this is really important. So my approach to the brain and how we conceive it. Second, I will give a brief introduction to the temporal-spatial theory of consciousness. What is it? What is the formal structure of that theory? Why do I do this? And then here I finally provide, this is the main part, I provide empirical support. I show you specific data with specific measures, novel and different ways of analyzing the data, which I deem to be necessary. We touched upon a little bit upon that in our prior discussion. So this is really the empirical key part. If empirical people, please stay with me. This is more sort of the conceptual background, but it's important because you need to understand the conceptual background in order to understand the kind of data analysis and the kind of measures I apply. Yeah, because this is, as Konstantin already said very nicely, this is outside the mainstream, what you see, the neural correlates of some cognitive functions and yet another region, yet another network, and blah, 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 blah. So, good. I start with the background, and this is the situation we really encounter. You have, and I touched upon this before in the discussion with you guys, we have sort of a gap of contingency. We do not have an intrinsic, or philosophically speaking, necessary connection between the neuronal and mental. Yeah, it's like, oh God, I don't have a proper comparison. It's like before you knew that the chemical formula of water and the liquid or the ice were similar, were the identical, there was a contingency between the two. Yeah, you didn't know that they were related. That's the situation we're confronting in the current neuroscience of consciousness and other mental features. So, and I argue you will see that our approach to the brain is simply a mismatch. When you have mental features, you have a certain structure, you have a certain dynamic, you have a certain topography, spatial organization. However, dynamic of consciousness, William James, streams of consciousness. Yeah, you have a continuous change pattern, and that consciousness consists in those patterns. That's dynamic. Spatial topography. You have a subjective spatial experience which can differ between the two. That is topography. So you have a mental topography. You have a mental dynamic. However, we approach the mental topography with specific regions or networks in the brain. So that's the first mismatch. Yeah? So how can you capture your whole mental topography with single regions and networks in the brain? It doesn't work. It's a mismatch. Same with the dynamic. So here I say, and you will see this in the analysis of the data, it's very fine-grained detail in the supplementary method part, usually that they just analyze discrete time points. They hardly never analyze the relation, the degree, the relative change from time point to time point. It's a very subtle difference, but makes a huge difference. Yeah? And you see it, and people, because they take it so for granted, they just slice up the time points or average across time points. This is another favorite strategy in the data. Yeah? And you really need to look into details there. So, and that, of course, also the other thing what I say is related to contents. They focus very much on specific contents, and they assume different contents, different neuronal activity. However, you might have different contents, same neuronal activity pattern. So how is that possible? As I understand, that's one of the key features of the functional systems approach. Yeah, so you have a mismatch. So, and of course, then your brain-mind relationship is by default contingent. You cannot find the relationship. So it's a conceptual issue. Here, my suggestion is, and that's my approach, we had a larger paper on this one last year in Physics of Life Review, and it's actually a Russian editor. That's why he was open to this kind of stuff. Yeah. So here we say, we look the brain in terms of topography. So we take a whole brain holistic approach, and then we look how the global activity is related to the local activity. I show you an example of that for the fMRI guys among you, global signal topography, just on the side, which will come later. Dynamic. Tempo changes. How is the relationship, for instance, between slow and fast frequency? Yeah? It is not the single frequency. It's not just theta alone. It's not just delta alone in the EEG. But it's the relationship, the slope of the curve between their power, for instance. And that amounts to space-time. And the assumption is, that's really the core assumption of our approach, that these kind of spatial temporal features, topography, dynamic, are shared by mental and neuronal activity. Yeah? So you have your spatial topography of your neuronal activity might surface in the spatial topography of your subjective experience. I know, and the same thing that your temporal dynamics of your brain might surface in the temporal dynamics of the changes in your consciousness. And we're doing that. This is, of course, the very early stages, and then we speak of a concurrency is this paper. So that's really a key paper which bridges the gap between the conceptual and the empirical. So if you want to understand, there are several examples in that paper. And that's really a key paper to understand the background here. So, and then, of course, I will come later that we call that spatial-temporal neuroscience. And explicitly in spatial-temporal neuroscience is not just a little bit the resting state, investigating some networks and some frequencies. No, it's a global approach, it's a temporal dynamic, and how that transfers into mental features and also structures cognitive features. Yeah? So I will come back at the end of my talk. So that's basically the theoretical background with which I operate, and always keep in mind this is very different from the traditional cognitive view of the brain. Yeah, in terms of module, okay, then they have some interaction between the modules, and but the global activity is at best an addition or summation of all the local networks. Yeah, and they start again with these abstract entities in the fMRI, the resting state networks, or in EEG, the different frequencies. So now I show you that is the background that I say consciousness is intrinsically temporal spatial, and the temporal spatial features of your experience of consciousness are shared by similar analogous temporal spatial features on the brain. So that's the main idea, common currency, temporal spatial theory of consciousness. Yeah, and that goes, and you will see we did a larger review paper last year. I did this with Victor Lammert, 2020, on the different theories of consciousness, and then we say, okay, and that really, our theory is really different in the whole thing. So show you this one. This is a background. I'm in Russia, so I probably don't need to explain much what I mean by temporal dynamics. So it's clear, this I already said, shared common currency. Similar temporal dynamics in your mental states. For instance, the degree to which your thought changes. We have a paper in revision, your thought dynamics. Yeah, and that may be related to an analogous dynamics in certain neuronal measures. Yeah. What do I mean by dynamic? I don't need to say. Here, waves, typical is my beloved example. Larger waves, larger waves are slow, but very powerful and more spatially extended. Whereas smaller waves in the seaside are less powerful, less spatially extended. That's basic principles of dynamics. Yeah, nothing else. And I argue they also hold for the brain. And you can measure it. And that is related to consciousness. That's basically the idea here. Typically, we look at the whole brain. Here's a certain topography. Here's the time series. You can decompose this. You all know this. Different frequencies, infraslow 0.01 hertz to 1 hertz, infraslow, which you measure with fMRI, faster ones with EEG, and of course when you go to the cellular level, you go even more up. So that's basically the idea. So that is the paper where we introduced that, 2017. We had many empirical studies since. I will show you some of that, and we have an update of the theory which will come out probably beginning of the year. And I was surprised how much empirical support also by others has been generated in this. So key point of this TTC up first. It bridging the gaps between spontaneous and stimulus-related activity. So this sounds completely trivial to you. However, when you have an fMRI, you have three kinds, there's a joke going on, three kinds of reviewers. First, you have reviewers who don't like resting state, say it's bullshit. That's the cognitive task people. Then you say, you have the resting state people. Okay, task-evoked activity is not relevant, just resting state. And the third type of reviewers who don't like fMRI at all. So, but that really reflects it very well. So you will see, for me, the interaction between spontaneous activity and stimulus is key. So we had a 2010 paper in Trends in Neuroscience on that. We spoke of rest-stimulus interaction. So and in the meantime, you will see some of that later. We devised these mechanisms. Yeah, and that holds also on the cellular level. That we show, look, the interaction between stimulus and task and resting state activity is non-additive, non-linear. And we even have a paper showing that on the cellular level. And that non-additivity, I suppose you will see later, has huge implications for how you perceive the external input. So, meaning, I come here to the second, that tentatively we claim it also bridges the gap between neuronal and phenomenal features. Meaning, we have neuronal hypothesis, because you need to revamp just the basic neuronal mechanism of the spatial temporal dynamics are not really fully clear in the current basic neuroscience. I'm always surprised how much I need to go into basic stuff. Yeah, I'm just in application. But yeah, and then of course the key is a neurophenomenal hypothesis, and I will show you some examples. Please forgive me, we are in the early days. I cannot provide that much empirical support to that, but I indicate. Yeah, because the phenomenal level, of course, is a difficult one. So, next one. So the main idea, this is a very complex table from the paper in 2017, but it tells you a little bit the structure. So we assume you have different kinds of dimensions of consciousness. Traditionally, you have the level of state, arousal. When you sleep, your level or state of consciousness reduces, and we assume for that a particular mechanism, which we call temporal spatial nestedness. I will explain that, what it means. And you will see the Russian dolls become central here. Then, so that we assume particular to be associated with a resting state. Then we have, and that's really a new dimension, we have what we call the form or organization of consciousness. So that philosophically obviously has a strong Kantian background. What do I mean by form? When you, for instance, you had this example before with the music, you're tapping to the rhythm of the music, you have a certain organization of your neuronal activity, meaning it's structured by the structure of the music, by the rhythmic structure of the music. And your brain synchronizes or aligns. And so meaning it establishes a certain form organization, and that's key. I call this temporal spatial alignment, and you will see, I will explain that in detail. Then we have the actual phenomenology, the subjective experience often called in the philosophy of mind qualia, a qualitative experience. I suppose that to be related to rest stimulus or pre-stimulus stimulus interaction, and we call that mechanism temporal spatial expansion. More detail to be followed in the later parts of the talk. Then the fourth mechanism is sort of the cognitive processing. That's basically where most of the current theories of concept, basically the consequences of all of these processes, the cognitive, when you become aware of your own consciousness. So in the philosophy of consciousness, net block access consciousness. This is phenomenal consciousness, this is access consciousness. And most theories operate here. So the IIT integrated information theory claims to be here. Global neuronal workspace, recurrent processing theory, higher order thought theory, all operate here. So, but they all leave that out. Then you have a couple of resting state theories, the entropy theory by Carter-Harris, and you have the Finkelkreuz brothers sort of operate here. Yeah? So what we do, and that is this integration between spontaneous and task-evoked activity. And what links the two are temporal spatial features. And I will explain that. And for instance, the conceptual here, neural correlates of consciousness would be here, neural consequences here, and here I speak of a neural predisposition of consciousness. So what I want to show you now is some of these. I can't remember what I have as the next slide. Yeah. So I want to now show you, so this is all the conceptual stuff, and now I will go into some empirical detail, show you how we try to operationalize these mechanisms. Again, as I said, these are early stages, preliminary work. This is like trying to walk in a dark jungle. So I show you some data on temporal spatial nestedness, alignment, expansion, globalization. This is for me, I'm more interested here in these parts of things. So I come, as I said, to this part. So this is now the key part where you can basically say whether I live up to the concepts I'm introducing here and to the model. So first mechanism, temporal spatial nestedness and the level or state of consciousness. It's clear, so I'm going this one, and this is about spontaneous activity, and particularly different kinds of temporal spatial features. As I said, I'm operating on the systemic level here, like infraslow fluctuations are important, temporal correlations, cross-frequency coupling, small worldness, graph theoretical measures. We had that before. and dynamic repertoire, and I will provide some flesh to the bones in the following. And first, of course, what do I mean by nestedness? I want to give you a little bit background. So in order to capture these kind of measures of temporal dynamic, you really need to go into physics and engineering, because they have a whole repertoire of different measures, and which you do. So when I explain you here some of the measures very briefly here, because they're important in the subsequent slides. So you have your, this is about temporal dynamics, brain dynamics. I show you here power law exponent scale-free activity. So you have your time series, and this time series, if you do a fast Fourier transformation or Hilbert transform or wavelet transform, you can decompose into different frequencies. Probably in your cellular data, you can go even much faster in the frequencies. In my world of EEG, fMRI, we can basically capture this here, the infra-slow frequencies, 0.01 hertz to 1 hertz. So it's basically 100-second cycle duration to 1 second. And then you have the traditional EEG frequencies, delta 1 to 4, theta 5 to 8, theta important, memory, learning, hippocampus, you all know this. Alpha 8 to 12, very important, it's basically like a gate. And then you have the beta, important for sensory-motor function, and gamma. However, I'm not interested in just all these single frequencies. I'm more interested in the relationship between these frequencies. So if you want to say so, I take a global dynamic approach. Yeah? So I'm interested in that you can plot, and I already mentioned, remember the example with the wave, with the C waves. Slower waves are much more powerful. That's what you see here. So here we plotted the frequencies. This is the logarithm, the frequency, and the power. And you see the lower the frequency, the larger the power. The faster the frequency, the less the power. Now you can measure this, the steepness of the curve, the shape of that curve. So that's basically a global across all frequencies. And you can measure the steepness or the shape of the curve. And that you can measure that by what is called the power law exponent, PLE. And you will see that again in my data, because you will see that the degree of steepness of the curve is highly relevant for consciousness, the level and state of consciousness. I will come back to that. Then the other measure, which I will come back, is the temporal autocorrelation. So you can measure the degree that, from, let's say, you have activity recorded at T1, T2, different time points, T1, T2, T3, T4, T4, and so forth. And then basically you have, of course, the highest correlation of T1 and T2, and then it's gradually decreasing when you go to more distant time points. And that degree of decrease you can measure with what is called the autocorrelation function. I will have another figure on that. So I focus now, there are various other measures, but I focus on these two measures, on the power law exponent and the temporal autocorrelation. So, and I said, we closely work together with physicists and engineers, and I have actually some PhD students from engineering, because they have all these measures of signal processing. Yeah, and they're really good in that. Yeah. So this is a paper now where we investigated anesthesia, surgical anesthesia, as a typical instance of a loss of consciousness. So you have this in the consciousness literature that basically you investigate altered or disordered state of consciousness, and then you infer from the changes whether that measure or parameter is relevant for consciousness. And this is, of course, obviously, you all know this in anesthesia, you lose your level or state of consciousness. So this was done by a very clever postdoc of mine, Jianfeng Zhang from China, who is now assistant professor in Shenzhen just recently. So what did he do? So he calculated the fMRI, and now for the fMRI specialist among you, he did a voxel-based approach. He calculated the power law exponent. Remember, that was the steepness of the curve of your power spectrum for each voxel in the brain. And you can see this here. So this is an fMRI. This is the same subject. It's an intra-subject, awake and anesthesia. And you can see the more red, the higher the power law exponent, meaning the steeper the curve, meaning the more slow frequency power relative to fast frequency power. That's what you can see here. Now in anesthesia, you can see it's completely blue. Basically, there's not much slow frequency power, and you will see why. It's a very interesting thing. Then he did the difference, intra-subject comparison, awake versus anesthesia, and you see basically the huge difference. So now the interesting thing. Look at this. So this is the power law exponent. The steepness of the curve is described by beta value. That's why beta is written here. You see, that's the typical power spectrum. This is the frequency range of fMRI, 0.01 to 0.1. This is the power, normalized power, important. And you see the typical, much more power in the slower waves, much less power in the faster waves. So, and indeed, I always like to compare the brain to the sea waves, because that's the way I imagine it visually. That's the way it is. Yeah? Because after all, I mean, the brain, there's nothing special to the brain. The brain is a dynamic organ of nature and embodies the same principles. I think it's more us who make it so special, because we don't understand it. So now, the interesting thing, look in anesthesia. The power spectrum is completely flat. There's no difference between slow and fast frequency anymore. So meaning the shape of the power spectrum is completely lost. Yeah? So if you don't have that shape anymore, you lose consciousness. Yeah? And here you see the comparison between awake and anesthetic. So you lose the shape of your power spectrum. You lose, and that is important now, interesting, I will explain that later, the temporal nestedness. Your faster frequencies are nested within the slower frequencies, power-wise. Yeah? And that's my beloved example. Some people know the Russian dolls. I will probably show some of that. So then I skip that one for the sake of simplicity. And this is, sorry, I skipped those pictures because it's too complicated. So here, what I discussed with the temporal nestedness is this one. So these are very nice figures made by my co-author Federico Zilio, an Italian philosopher and neuroscientist, and who is a co-author on the here on this paper, which will come out soon. And because he always makes so nice figures, you will see more of them. Another postdoc from Spain called him Federico da Vinci. Yeah, so I really like that. So you see here is the healthy state. You see different time scales, yeah, and that's the power, and you see this relationship, more power for the slower time scales, less power for the faster time scales. This is schematically, obviously, yeah? And you can see that, so there's a certain relationship. The the faster time scales are contained and nested in their power within the slower time scales. So that's a typical here, very nice, the shape indicated by the size of the Russian dolls. So now, imagine if you now make the smaller Russian dolls, you make them smaller. Yeah, or you take one out. Then you get this one. Then you suddenly have the larger one is much larger relative to the other ones. So meaning your slow frequencies are abnormally strong relative to the faster frequencies. I will show you data later. That's what happens in sleep stages, N1, N2, and 3. It's a gradual. However, you lose the actual consciousness, but in sleep, you still have the propensity to wake up and regain consciousness. Yeah? So that's important because the basic shape of your power spectrum is still there, it's just abnormally tilted. Yeah? However, when you lose, like in anesthesia, the basic shape of your power spectrum, you lose consciousness and you cannot regain consciousness. So meaning you have no predisposition for consciousness anymore. It's over. Goodbye. Yeah? And that's what you see is completely flat. You have no differentiation anymore between the different frequencies. Yeah, and that's really data-driven. So here I like to speak, as you see, you have no longer any Russian doll, it's just this up-errant thing. So that's completely lost. You cannot even see any Russian dolls in there anymore. Then the same happens in spatial nestedness. So you have global brain activity, and the global activity is, of course, spatially the largest extended, global in a relative sense, and probably also has very strong power in the very slow frequency ranges. That's supported by data, monkey intracranial recording data. And in fMRI, we measure that via the global signal. So now the fMRI people among you say, oh God, what is this Northoff with the global signal? Global signal needs to be regressed out of the data because it's just noise. No, it's one key component of neuronal activity. So, and that's basically a schema for spatial nestedness, that the global activity then contains or nests different regions, different networks. So it goes from global to local. And it's not that your global activity is just an addition of your local activity. No, it's not from local to global. It's the other way around. It's a continuous differentiation. Yeah, as in the power spectrum. It's a continuous differentiation. And if you lose the ability to differentiate, then you lose consciousness. And that is in these data. So this is a paper, Sean Tanabe, former PhD student of mine, which we published. So here we had monkey data, monkey awake and monkey anesthesia. No, sorry, it was rats, anesthetic awake state. We had human sleep fMRI data, we had human anesthesia data, and we had vegetative state, coma, unresponsive wakefulness. And what we saw in all these different data sets, we saw that the global activity level was decreased and parametrically decreased relative to the level of consciousness. Meaning, the lower your level of global activity, the lower your level or state of consciousness. So that is very interesting. And it's really, and we hold it across all data sets, and it was a parametric relationship. Yeah, because we had also different sleep stages, for instance, N1, N2, N3. So meaning, it is really the global activity which is key for consciousness. Then, in addition, we also measured the global to local relationship. You can see this, for instance, here. Here you have a high global signal or global activity. Here you have a low. What you also see, you see much more regional differentiation when you have high global activity. Meaning your global activity is represented in different degrees in the different regions. And the more differences, so you establish a certain topography, a global signal topography, from global to local, the degree to which your global activity is represented in the local activity. So it's a completely different approach to the brain. And that degree is key, again, for the level or state of consciousness. And it's not the other way around. It's not one single region, like, for instance, Dehen in his global neuronal workspace, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It is not, this goes actually against integration, information integration as in the integrated information theory. These are all secondary, tertiary processes. This is the key thing. Yeah? So it's really, and this is I'm a big fan of this global signal stuff because we also apply it in psychiatry, and you can see the degree to which the global activity is represented in different regions is probably related to the kind of symptoms you have. For instance, in manic patients with mania, they run around like crazy. I would like to simulate, but YouTube doesn't allow me. That you have increased representation of global activity in the motor cortex. Makes perfect sense. That's why you move, that's why you have the psychomotor increase in these guys. Next one. So that's basically, and you see nestedness is the key component which can be operationalized by scale freeness or power law exponent. Yeah? And global signal topography. You can also apply the PLE on the spatial level. And of course, you can also do graph graph-based measures here for the network stuff, and indeed we have a paper on that show again graph-related measures, path length, distance, closeness, integration are highly related to consciousness. Second mechanism, temporal spatial alignment and the form and structure or structure of consciousness. So that's one of my favorite ones because, as you know, I'm also a philosopher. This I deem the most philosophically relevant. And I will indicate that briefly, but I just show here the theory, but I mentioned that. So what is this about? So this is about the form. It's basically about still spontaneous activity, but now prior to the onset of the input, or during the encoding of stochastic inputs, because the brain is never at rest. That's the most stupidest assumption. Our brain, even in sleep, four of the five senses are open, so you continuously encode the temporal stochastics of your environmental context. When I do this, you will encode that sequence in your brain. You will phase align your temporal windows, will integrate the stimuli, and so on. You have no choice. Your brain does it for you. There's no voluntary control. So you cannot avoid following my finger unless you fall asleep. Yeah? But even then, you cannot avoid my voice. So no hope to escape me. And that's what we call temporal spatial alignment. Typical example, you listen to music, you unconsciously tap the beat of the music. There's no voluntary good. Your brain does it for you. Yeah, that's, remember, the 95% unconscious at the beginning. So how can you measure the alignment? There are different measures. I just emphasize here the autocorrelation function. And remember, I said here, this is basically you correlate your activity with itself. What it called lags is time lags, is different time points. And of course, the more distant, the less autocorrelation. And here you have the degree of correlation. Here you have the time points, or what is called here lags. And typically you get a curve like this. This is an autocorrelation function. And you can also do this in cellular data, and it has been done. No doubt. And what is interesting, basically like here, my favorite example. Yeah, for instance, look here. So this is a smaller window. If you take all these together, it's a larger window. If they were open, you would see completely different things through it. Same with the temporal window. If you have a larger temporal window, you perceive different things than through a smaller window. Yeah? In the smaller window, you see more details. In the larger window, you see more the whole. I will come back to that. Yeah? So, and what is interesting, your brain is very clever. It's much cleverer than us. It's unbelievable. So the brain has different timescales. So this is a paper which we published in Nature Communication Biology this year about the topographical distribution of timescales in the brain. And you see here, for instance, the more red, the longer the timescales, the meaning the larger the windows, and the more blue, the smaller, the shorter the time windows. And what you see here, this is motor cortex, this is sensory visual cortex, auditory cortex. You see those timescales are relatively short. And that makes sense because you need to react fast, you have a lot of detail, and that's what your sensory cortex is doing. Then when you more go to the sort of inner of the brain, my beloved cortical midline structures, the timescales get longer. Interestingly here, what we call the fault mode network, particularly here, see red, very red. So this has been done in fMRI by others and by us in EEG, MEG. And they are called intrinsic because they're present in both rest and task state. They're only just modulated by the task state. So it's a typical example of what I called earlier rest task modulation. So this is an important thing. And now the question is, how are these timescales related to consciousness? So the main idea background here, and I mentioned that before in the discussion, when you listen to music like Shostakovich, Prokofiev, they have different timescales. And these composers are usually masters in integrating these different timescales, that to compose their pieces in such a way that you hear certain things together and certain things not. Meaning they are masters in deciphering which tones, which sequences will be integrated in your perception and which ones not. So I always say to my partner, who is a composer, that there's much better knowledge of neuroscience than I have. Yeah, it's an implicit knowledge. So what do? You match your own intrinsic timescales of your brain with the timescales of the environment. That's why you can synchronize with the music. That's why you can follow my speech. You synchronize your timescales with my speech, and I emphasize certain things so that you know, okay, now I probably need another window because he emphasizes so might be important. So your brain does it for you. You have no voluntary control over that. Forget all that. Yeah? So you have this matching, and this is completely unconscious. Yeah? I'm not talking about anything cognitive here. Yeah? It's a continuous matching of environmental neural timescales in your language. That's why I'm so interested in encoding. So the cognitive neuroscience and a lot of Anglo-American neuroscience always focuses on decoding. How can I decode contents from the neuronal activity? But that's secondary. I'm much more interested in how the brain shapes and constitutes what we call contents. That's the encoding. Yeah? When you see my Unlocking the Brain 2014, the first volume, the first introduction is just all about encoding versus decoding. Yeah? So, and this is, I think, a key point, and also key, I think, also on the cellular level. And I was really very interestingly, positively surprised that you link the functional system very close to the encoding processes. Yeah? That was very, very interesting for me, that you basically almost, as I understood, devise an intrinsic relationship there. So, meaning what you match, how you relate your brain to the environment is through the timescales. So now, is that important for consciousness? So that by itself has not been much investigated, and we're devising now a lot of studies where we analyze the timescales of the input and the timescales of the brain. So now, the interesting thing is now, are these timescales related to the to consciousness? So this is an investigation by Federico Ciglio, who does the nice figures, Federico da Vinci, who is a philosopher in neuroscience and scientist in Pavia. So here's the idea. We link intrinsic timescales to consciousness and also input processing. Because you will see he did a very clever thing here. So the first thing, so this is again, this is kind of curves you get. It's your autocorrelation window. Remember the time lag correlation. And this is the kind of curves you get. Here each line is one subject. You see considerable intersubject variability always. And then basically at 0.5 of your autocorrelation, you determine the window. And that's what is called autocorrelation window, or short ACW. He also calculated the power law exponent. You can see this here. I focus mainly. So these are the first data here. Here you see the ACW, meaning the autocorrelation window, and you can see these are sleep EEG data. This is REM, non-REM 1, non-REM 2, 3, and these are dreams, REM stages, and you see an increase timescales. That was expected. Your timescales become longer. Why? Because your slow frequencies become relatively stronger than the faster frequency. A typical finding, shift towards slower frequencies, and you lose consciousness. Your autocorrelation window becomes longer. Next thing, then he did the same in anesthesia. Different forms of anesthesia, it's all EEG now. Ketamine, you see a prolongation of the timescale. You see a much larger ACW prolongation in sevoflurane. Then here, anesthesia, again, you see abnormally long autocorrelation window. So what does this mean? If you have a longer autocorrelation window, you integrate much more. It's like you have a bigger cooking pot, you put much more things in there, they all become the same. If you have a smaller cooking pot, you cannot put as much in there. So much remains outside. So here, basically, everything becomes equal. And you will see that will happen in perception. I will show the slide. So now you say, yeah, Northoff, but how are these autocorrelation window changes really, are they really related to input processing? And is that really related to consciousness? So here did a very clever thing. We had patients, which was called amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. They all lose their motor output. It's a very, very sad condition. You don't wish that to anybody, not even your enemy. So they all lose their muscle strength because the second motor neuron is disturbed, and they cannot move anymore. So at the end, they cannot move at all. They probably can't even breathe, but their consciousness is maintained. Typical example, Stephen Hawking. And so here, the output / the motor function is disturbed, but consciousness is still preserved, meaning your input processing must still be preserved. And that's exactly what we see. Their ACW, your autocorrelation window, was completely normal. Here we had also 2 patients with a complete locked-in syndrome. They couldn't move at all anymore. Yeah? So that I know, it's a rather indirect way of showing it, but still it's an indirect way that this ACW stuff may be really related to input processing and encoding rather than to output processing, motor behavior. And we have further studies now in the pipeline and papers on this. So it's a key process. Here you see the nice overview. You see basically this is a very nice graphic abstract. You see the different conditions. Sleep, you have an increase in your time scales get longer. You have anesthesia, time scales longer. Your vegetative state, your time scales longer. Your motor output is lost. This amyotrophy, this locked-in syndrome, time scales are normal. And here it's a summary. Your time scales get longer. Activity gets slower. In the sensory deficiency stat, where you lose consciousness, in your motor deficiencies, the autocorrelation window and the speed remains normal. Meaning, what does this now mean? When you have too long time scales, everything is integrated. So too much temporal integration without temporal segregation. So meaning you put all the different tones from a music piece together and you cannot distinguish anymore between the melody and the non-melody. Yeah? You just hear it as one homogeneous mass. Everything is the same. The world is one big box. And now this is a very nice figure from my Italian postdoc, Federico Zilio. You see here, this is basically, you have a repertoire, you have different types of time scales. Slow, fast, many fast, and a lot of slow and fast. So you can time resolve your external input in a very fine-grained way. So it's about temporal resolution. And now, if your time scale gets longer, like when you lose consciousness, you don't have that fine-grained temporal resolution anymore. Meaning the different time points are integrated and your picture will be blurry. Yeah? This is schematically put, but in the future, we really hope to basically reconstruct your perceptual image out of these autocorrelation window data. Yeah? So basically that's basically like in diabetes, your glucose level, you can predict the symptoms, and here basically you can predict the perception. That's the idea. That's what we are up to, the perceptual reconstruction. And so I imagine when you lose consciousness, you just perceive everything the same. It's like a black box, and ultimately you lose it completely. So, and then this is the figure I added after our discussion, hearing that you investigate these different animal species. Of course, I don't want to go into the debate whether animals have consciousness or not, because for me it's a non-question. Of course they have consciousness. Yeah, it's human arrogance to say they have not, and you see it in their behavior. So that's, for me, I know that's not an argument what I provided, but it's not relevant. But what is relevant is the scope of their consciousness, the range, the spatial and temporal range of their consciousness. Then philosophy, the classical discussion that bats can process ultrasonic waves, but humans can't. So I assume that ultrasonic waves and the time scales the bats have, humans don't have. So different species, different time scales. So this is more schematics. This is not empirical data, but for instance, you have assumed that the mouse, cat, monkey, human have different time scales. The humans have probably much more fine-grained time scales, meaning that topography of time scales, remember what I showed you, these colorful brains, they have probably the different regions' timescales are much more homogeneous in the mouse than in the human, and also monkey and human. So and with that, and remember the previous figure, how you time resolve the temporal resolution of your perception depends upon your time scales. So if you only have such a low number of time scale, your temporal resolution of how you perceive the environment in code is very low. Yeah? So they might perceive the world in a much more simplistic and blurry way than us. Again, if you can really manage sort of the perceptual reconstruction out of these timescales, then you can have an idea how the mouse or how the rat or the monkey perceives. And so my ideal, this is what I'm always would love to do, I haven't realized it yet, it's really an experiment where you present the same stimulus, the same visual input, let's say, or auditory input in different frequencies. And you tailor the frequencies according to what you know about the time scales of these species. And you present this, let's say, to mouse, cat, monkey, humans, and then you investigate their time scales, and then you have a behavioral task and react it. So this would be really a cross-species time scales, and then you can do a perceptual reconstruction. And that's feasible. Yeah? So that's something, and you can do this, let's say, in fMRI or EEG or intracranial recording. So I think I leave it. So this is the review paper which we published this year. Also, the brain and its intrinsic timescales are key for input processing. That's why I'm so interested in encoding. Why is that philosophically relevant? Because this is about temporal spatial alignment, the degree to which you can synchronize your brain with the environment, with the context, the environment, or the world. And that becomes relevant for, let's say, ontological questions. Ontological questions are about the world, the existence and reality in the world. So here you have the direct link. And it also means that consciousness is not purely neuronal. You need alignment. If you do not have alignment, you lose your consciousness. Yeah? So that's a real issue. So consciousness is, for me, intrinsically neuroecological rather than neuronal, if you want to put it into conceptual context. And that's basically missed by all current neuroscientific theories of consciousness. They're all neuronal or embodied. Yeah? But it's here the link to the world. So, third mechanism, temporal spatial expansion and the content of consciousness. Finally, remember, I just showed you about different time scales, nestedness, temporal spatial nestedness. I showed you alignment. I haven't said anything about the content of your consciousness. So all other theories basically start with the content of consciousness. So they leave out, they just show, let's say, the upper body at best, or maybe just the head, but they not focus on the legs. That's why I think they cannot get there. So third mechanism is the most difficult one. And this is basically about now, how does spontaneous activity interact with the external input, such that you have a phenomenal experience. Qualia, philosophically speaking. Ipseity, some phenomenological features here. Intentionality, and blah, blah, blah. So these are typical measures. And so these are various measures, and I said, look into our Northoff 2020 paper for an overview of the different theories of consciousness. They have different kinds of measures, P50, N100, and so forth, or P3B, Dehaene, and so on and so on. And different regions, whether it's posterior sensor regions, IIT, or DLPFC, global neuronal workspace, or recurrent feedback loops, LAME in the recurrent processing theory, or higher order theory. So it's all different regions, so I don't want to go into that. You probably most know all that. But what I want to say, how are these phenomenal features possible? So I would argue that here the external input, stimulus or event, needs to interact with what happened here. So this is, as I said, what we call rest task or pre-stimulus task interaction. And I want to show you a little bit of that because it's really relevant, and we touched upon that also in our discussion. Here. So this is, of course, typical example of nestedness. So you have the spontaneous activity. Then you have the pre-stimulus activity. Then you have the early post-stimulus activity, and then the late. Here the external stimulus comes in. However, what you often see in current data analysis, these are cancelled out. They set to 0. When you analyze ERP, you basically set your pre-stimulus to the baseline, 0 for all trials, 0 for all subjects. Yeah? So meaning you miss this interaction. And then, of course, often they don't even record resting state and so on. You miss this one. Yeah? But for me, that's exactly the component of the signal which you need to have conscious experience. And as I said, it's when you look into, you often need to look into the supplementary method of the papers in the small written parts, what they did. For instance, in fMRI, they scale out the scale-free component. I read intracranial studies where they even cancel out all phase-related information. They set it to the phase modulus. In fMRI, they cancel out the scale-free component. So everything, because they consider it's just noise from this cognitive perspective. So, so that's a real problem. And I now want to show you the mechanism of this and this interaction is not fully clear. So the standard model for that, have a look here, it's basically you have different degrees of pre-stimulus activity, and the stimulus induces the same degree of activity in all these pre-stimulus levels. So this is purely additive. It's just on top of it is added. It doesn't matter how high or low your pre-stimulus activity is. In each case, the external input induces the same degree of activity, which you can see here. So it's a purely additive model. And that model is really presupposed in many, many current studies. However, there have been indeed in consciousness some studies where they show that pre-stimulus activity level presuppose also predict consciousness. That was studies mainly in EEG. We have a recent study, a paper coming out on the global signal in the pre-stimulus activity. Then you have another form of interaction that, let's say, for instance, when your pre-stimulus activity is low, you don't have much change. But when your pre-stimulus activity is high, you have a lot of change. Meaning the level of pre-stimulus activity has an impact on the system's responsiveness to the external input. That's dynamic systems theory. And that is non-additive or non-linear. So this is a positive non-additivity. And then you can have also the opposite. You have very low levels, you have a high activity, and you have very high pre-stimulus level and not much change by the external stimulus. So what holds, so this is non-additive, this is additive. And there's strong evidence by our group as well as others that there's really a non-additive. And we showed this in fMRI. We showed this in EEG, is the paper I will show you next. And we also showed this on the cellular level. This is a recent paper, 2021, where we really showed it's a non-additive modulation during a decision task. So that's basically, there's a non-additive, well, that's why I looked for your pre-stimulus data, a non-additive interaction between pre-stimulus and the external input. So let me show a little bit here of that. This is a paper which came out this year from Søren Veinjø Tiberge, very, very clever undergraduate student at the time, very, very clever guy. So here, this is MEG data. So this is in magnetic encephalography. And you see this is basically blue and red is here where we corrected pre-stim low and pre-stim high. And you see the difference. Corrected means that we took out the spontaneous resting state fluctuations. We call that pseudo-trial. So we correct for that because you need to have, for the spontaneity of the fluctuation, you need to correct. So the blue is pre-stim low, the red is pre-stimulus high, and you see there's a positive interaction. So when you have higher pre-stim, you have higher post-stim activity relative to a lower pre-stim level. So the only difference between these two curves is the low and high pre-stim. But you see that makes an impact on the post-stim. So this is a positive interaction, interestingly occurring in the delta band. And when you then look in the theta band, you somewhat still see this. In the alpha, 8 to 12 Hz, you have the opposite. Now, the red stuff is the high pre-stim. Now you see lower activity than in the low pre-stim. So you see lower post-stim activity in the high pre-stim than in the low pre-stim. So here you have the negative non-additive interaction. So these are basically is your responsiveness of your brain's actual state in the pre-stimulus to the external input. So in more general terms, this means that your brain has a say in what the stimulus induces in the brain. Yeah, and that's very, very confusing for the cognitive people. When we submit these papers on pre-stimulus task interactions, the reviewers have no idea why we do this. I mean, it's unbelievable. For me, it's so evident, yeah, because it's a dynamic system, and the degree of perturbation by external input depends upon the state of your system. I mean, this is most basic, basically the first day of your dynamic systems lecture in physics. Yeah, but it's unbelievable. It's incredible. Let me go this one. So this is an intracranial EEG study, which was done by a postdoc of mine, Anne-Marie Wolf. She does very, very interesting stuff. Let me walk a little bit. So this is pure post-stimulus. This is your trial-to-trial variability. So what is trial-to-trial variability? Is basically you have the same input, but across the different trials, you have a variability in your amplitude. Because you have always the same stimulus, the only way where this variability can come from is from your pre-stimulus. And there was indeed a recent paper by a French group which associated that degree of trial-to-trial variability with consciousness. So here I show you again, and this is basically an impact. You see here the TTV low means trial-to-trial variability in low pre-stimulus activity, and you see trial-trial variability. Here's it's the blue stuff, the green stuff. That's the trial-to-trial variability. The other one is the resting state, is spontaneous variability. That's what we call pseudo-trial. You see, if you don't have a stimulus, your variability increases, whereas if you have the stimulus, it suppresses the trial-to-trial variability. It synchronizes the brain for a short, transient period of time. And you see really different degrees of trial-to-trial variability in your pre-stim low and pre-stim high. You see here the significance level of the difference. And then what she did a very clever thing. Then she looked at different intervals in post-stimulus activity, how much they are determined by the pre-stimulus activity. So what you see here, the green bar and the gray bar, so you see this is a real low trials. These are PL is a pseudo trial. That's from the resting state. So the impact of the pre-stimulus low trials on the early stimulus, 300 milliseconds, did not distinguish from the pseudo trials. So this means that your early stimulus-induced activity is mainly determined by your pre-stimulus activity, not the inputs. This was a very short 200 millisecond word here. Yeah? Whereas in later 300 to 400, 600 millisecond, then you really saw a difference that your pre-stimulus had not as much impact as the external input. So meaning it's always a balance between pre-stimulus activity and the impact of the external input in your post-stimulus period. So, and there are studies, some of our stuff and others, we haven't really linked the non-additivity itself to consciousness, but there is pre-stimulus data as well as trial-to-trial variability data linking it to consciousness. So how and why do you now have a phenomenal experience? So that's, of course, the key question where everybody will measure my stuff. And if I cannot answer that question, you say, Northoff, go home. Go back to Canada. So let me, and then I want to explain this one. So let's say here you have a physical input. You have this gun. Okay? Let's say could be a Wild West movie in USA. Or maybe even, unfortunately, a real scenario. So you have, that is the physical duration of your input. That's the timing. So now that post-stimulus input meets, that physical input meets, encounters your pre-stimulus activity. Yeah? So and in your pre-stimulus activity, you have, for instance, a stadium. Yeah? So you have a certain fantasy, certain image in your pre-stimulus activity, like a stadium. As I said, this is all schematically. So now the stimulus input comes to your, the external input comes to your pre-stimulus, encounters your pre-stimulus. So you have this one, but then, of course, you integrate the two. So now I would argue that's a non-additivity. So now, next one. Then you say this may be more slower frequency, this may be more faster frequency, indicated by this faster frequency. So you decompose your external input in temporal terms here, and you decompose your pre-stimulus activity also in temporal terms. So meaning you have a faster frequency encountering the faster frequency of your external input, encountering the slower frequency of your pre-stimulus activity. What happens, you know it as Russians, the faster one is integrated within the slower one. It's a basic dynamical principle. So what happens by that, now suddenly this one is the temporal faster timescales of this one is integrated within the slower, the longer cycle durations, the larger windows of your pre-stimulus activity. So now, and then there is a non-additive interaction, so you put them two together and you perceive this one. So meaning, let's say if I had imagined here being in a lecture, yeah, I'm seeing here in a lecture, and then somebody would come up with a gun, then I would say, okay, maybe here somebody wants to kill me or whatever. Yeah? So meaning, and that's what you perceive. And what is important, now then you perceive that stimulus, let's say you present it for 100 milliseconds, and it should only be represented in your perception for 100 milliseconds. But that's not true. So you're in alpha range. Now your pre-stimulus is very strong in delta. So now you, let's say 2 hertz. So your 100 millisecond is integrated within the 500 millisecond of your 2 hertz, meaning you perceive the stimulus 400 milliseconds longer than it actually is. That's what I mean by expansion. Temporal expansion, it's a virtual temporal expansion beyond the physical duration of the stimulus. And the longer that expansion is, then you have an experience, a phenomenal experience. Yeah? So now how that is related to qualia, ipseity, etc. remains to be done, but we are trying to search that. So that's what I mean by temporal expansion. And I explain this so much in detail because I know that usually my explanations fail and that people have a hard time understanding that. So, and that gives you phenomenal features. That is your, because basically the degree of your phenomenal features is the temporal spatial discrepancy between the actual physical temporal spatial features of your input and your ongoing temporal spatial features of your brain, within which the temporal spatial features of the input are integrated. So, and I think I close to the end. So here it's an overview figure where we say this form mechanism and any measure of a successful theory of consciousness need to be able to differentiate different clinical states of consciousness. Not only clinical, non-clinical. If you cannot make that distinction, the theory of consciousness is not successful. So you need clinical and non-clinical prediction. And sort of here we plotted the four mechanisms in the 4 dimensions. This is globalization, this is alignment, this is nestedness, this is expansion. And we plotted the different mechanisms according to the empirical findings here in this graph. And you can see you have ROM slave if you're in 2 and 3, unresponsive wakefulness, anesthesia, coma, brain death. Of course, everything is set to 0. We also included here some psychotic disorders, and that, of course, to be refined. But I think it offers a good tool for the differentiation of these mechanisms. So let me conclude a couple of slides. Where come I from? This is the overview paper which I mentioned by Victor Lamme and me, 2020, where we compare the different theories of consciousness. And here we start with late post-stimulus, early post-stimulus, pre-stimulus activity, and then spontaneous activity, how we group the different theories. We focused here on, you can see this here, integrated information theory, global neuronal, higher order, predictive coding, embodied approaches, entropy, and the operational space-time by Finkelkurt. So this, for anybody who's interested in the main message of that paper, is basically that the temporal spatial theory provides an overarching framework within which these different theories can be integrated. So neuroscience of consciousness, I leave that out. So I come back to my idea of this common currency. I hope I could make that claim a little bit more intuitive than it was. And I mentioned the quote here by Nikola Tesla, a very interesting guy. Highly recommended to look up his website, not his website, his Wikipedia entry. And you know that Elon Musk, however controversial he is, strongly relies on Tesla, hence the name Tesla for his cars. And he said a very good thing. If you want to find the secret of the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, vibration. Basic dynamic principles, I add the topography, and that's why we say here, is it really the common currency in quest of a spatial neuroscience? I already showed that, and I want to finish with this one. This is very important for me because you have the spontaneous activity, you have what you call an inner time and space. It's not the perception of time and space, how the brain itself constructs its own time and space. That's why I investigated all these different measures of brain dynamics and topography, and I'm constantly looking out for more measures of dynamic and topography. This could also be another field of exchange. And that's spatial temporal neuroscience, and that then in turn structures your brain function, meaning your cognitive function, social function. And when you see in the next figure, I include here the mental features. Yeah? So we are focusing on consciousness, self, mind wandering, psychiatry. And so you see they're basic, they're on a much deeper level than all these functions. And I think that's a real problem that's too high of a level. And of course, the spatial temporal stuff. And with that, I come to an end. If you find this theory promising, I would be happy. If not, I would be happy if you contradict me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this wonderful lecture. Questions, please. One by one. Here, please. Just a moment, I will give you a microphone.
Roger. Let us imagine a physical system. It may be fairly simple, but the oscillations are complex. So a system with some oscillations, it reacts to the environment, and it can be perturbed in certain ways. And it's not a biological system. I don't know, pendulums or something like that. It has some sort of memory, that's very simple, but the profile, the structure of these oscillations are reminiscent of what you presented concerning the brain. So the question is there non-neuronal consciousness, in your opinion? So may this system have consciousness?
Now you you motivate me. I should have included that, but maybe I do this on Saturday, my artificial intelligence, my robot slide. So in the paper on timescales, which comes out in Trends in Cognitive Science, we will have a figure on, let's say, if you have a robot, and the current artificial intelligence or robot have usually a very small number of timescales. They have timescales to one particular task, like chess, Go, or whatever. But they don't have the variety of different timescales. So my criterion here for your question would be the number of timescales and the encoding process. How does this robot encode? If the robot or artificial device just encode each time point stimulus independent of the respective other, the robot will have not consciousness. So I call that stimulus-based coding. If the robot encodes the relationship between time points, so the stochastics, that robot will have consciousness. And then I would say the scope, the kind of temporal scales the robot can experience in her or his consciousness, depends upon the number of intrinsic time scales, which probably, and I remember you said that before, formed by evolution and so forth, and actual environmental exposure. Yeah, so my answer is very clear for that. And that's, for me, this temporal spatial alignment is, for me, the most interesting mechanism, of course. And it's very simple, just here with the ACW, with the autocorrelation, you have other measures for that. Yeah. So, and because that's what humans are still very special. You can adapt. You can learn different tasks. Yeah, we're very flexible. That's amazing.
Thank you very much.
I'm not a robot, just to let you know. I think I'm not one. Yeah.
Could you pass the microphone back to the next question?
Thank you for the lecture. Can you show me a slide where you have a 3D map, 3D graph? It's one of the last slides.
Which?
Spatial alignment, temporal nestedness. Yes, this one.
This one?
No, this one. So my question is, if you take a number of animals, from worms to insects to like mammals, humans, dolphins, and you take them in fully aware state and unconscious state, and you plot that on this graph. What will be the differences between, I said, insect and a human in unconscious state? What will be the difference between them in, there was an answer for one of my questions here. What will be the difference in conscious state? And will there all animals fall on like linear scale, or there will be some leaps, like, I don't know, between insects and, I don't know, mammals, between mammals and human, and so on?
Yeah. Very, 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 very good question. I would love to be able to answer that. Very intuitive answer. If you have a low number of time scales, like the mouse, it's a schematic thing here. So please, any animal, you know much more about animals than I do, so please forgive me here. I would say that the difference between the conscious and unconscious state is much smaller in the mouse than in the human, because of your number of time scales. Yeah. But that's a very intuitive answer. Does that answer your question? So, and for me, it's really, for me, consciousness, and this is also phenomenological comment, it's very important here, I didn't mention that so far. For me, consciousness is how you experience yourself relative to your environmental context. That's what I think, what Thomas Nagel means by point of view. It's not first-person perspective. First-person perspective, because also your third-person perspective depends upon your point of view. And I consider that point of view to be spatial-temporally configured. That's the relationship, the relative relation between my repertoire of my time scales, or space scales, relative to my environmental context. Yeah? So that gives me a point of view, literally point of view. We have a paper on that, it goes back and forth between us and the reviewers because the reviewers don't get it. Yeah, it's unbelievable. So, and I think the point of view of the mouse, it has a point of view, I'm sure, but it's much more spatial temporally restricted. Meaning, and when you look at this one here, okay, now I need to do this, now I need to explain this. The discrepancy between the timescales of the environment and the timescales of the mouse is much larger, as the black stuff here, than in humans. It's much smaller. That's a prediction, but I think it can be empirically tested.
One little more question. And do you think that there are some leaps between animals? I don't know, we have a small monkey, ape, and a human. Is there a linear change in our, I don't know, alignment window, or do you think there are some consciousness leaps?
Of course, I'm sure there are gaps, and you forgot what I really would like to do, and I have a very clever guy who already built a robot. I would like to build a robot which has more timescales than us, and see how the robot behaves. Yeah? Whether there are leaps, gaps, I'm the wrong person to ask, because first I don't have the experience in this work, and I don't have the evolutionary background. But I cannot imagine that there are not gaps or nonlinear gaps between species. I just cannot imagine, but it's definitely not a parametric thing. But again,
I have a suggestion to your discussion and a question to you, whether you think it is consistent with this graph on different time scales, hypothetical graph. I will need to draw.
Ah, okay.
These time scales have to be represented in the activity of the brain. And furthermore, they have to be represented in a kind of a not simply local but global activity of the brain. So the question or suggestion for empirical test would be, would you think it would be feasible to equate the existence of different durations of the time scales with the durations of activity of groups of neurons in a continuum? Forget about stimulus and perception and any stimulus-induced activity. Take a continuum of behavior or even resting state in the brain. And if we will record with the population recording, which we can do with thousands of neurons, and in the conscious brain, it will be a systems activity. If we will record the durations at which particular neurons, and we know that in the awake conscious brain they fire together with other groups globally. For which they fire, and then make a table that there is a certain number of systems which can be traced in time, which has this range of durations of firing. Very short one, longer one, longer one, longer one, longer one. Okay. And if we will take this recording, let's say from a mouse, and compare it to the recording from a monkey,
yeah, etc.,
across species, would you predict that probably we will see the wider range of durations moving along the diagram which you draw, so that what you draw here as imaginary will actually correspond really to what you observe in the systems of neural activity?
Excellent question. So the first thing which I would do, I would analyze the temporal course. So I would do a dynamic ACW analysis. And basically, I would calculate an ACW, CV, or ST value, coefficient of variation. And we did that. And interestingly, so I take, let's say, the degree of variance of your time scale as a proxy, your ACW, CV, as an indirect proxy of input processing. Input could also be internal input. Yes. Yeah, it can be in the resting state. And what we observe, we're just putting this together, that we really observe, we have other measures. We had the PLE, power law exponent, median frequency, impulsive complexity. And the CV is always the highest in the ACW. Mm-hmm. So that really suggests to me that the time windows are really for input processing. That's why we wrote this paper. One of the reasons is back. So here, I would do that within and across. Yes. Yeah. And I would argue that first, your variability in the monkey is higher. Yeah, because that's an indirect proxy for the scope, temporal scope of what you encode. Yeah, so that's the first thing. Then I would also say, let's say, if you just do a topographic mapping of your different time scales, you have more regions in the brain here than here. So you have.
In what respect?
Yeah.
That it will be unequally distributed?
Yeah, that's a tricky question.
What you mentioned about different brain areas,
sizes
for different temporal.
Yeah, so I would suggest that's of course a very tricky one operationally, because if this guy has a lower number of brain regions than this one, then you cannot say this has a lower number of time scales, because you will need to plot your number of time scales relative to the number of regions. So that's tricky, otherwise you get. But that's what I would do. So I would argue probably, and then you can basically you do a whole brain topography of time scales, you normalize your number of different time scales according to the brain regions, and then you can basically calculate, let's say, a topographical time scale differentiation index. Yeah, and I expect that to be much higher here than here. Yeah, and I think that would go along those lines. And the third thing which I would do is now really trying to impute different stimuli. So let's say you're the expert. Auditory, let's say we do auditory for all three, and we present the auditory input in different frequencies. So same stimulus, just in different frequencies. We have a couple of papers now where we did this in humans. And just the frequency of the presentation makes a difference. You're not surprised. The cognitive people are, because they never look at the temporal structure of your paradigm. It's unbelievable. Yeah? So that's what I would do, and I would expect, let's say I have a parametric frequency, let's say I present auditory stimuli, let's say in the frequency range, let's say I just make up something from 1 hertz, let's say to 10 hertz. Yeah, I have a 10 parametric degrees, and I would expect that the ACW CV differentiation among these 10 parametric sense is the best differentiation in the humans and the lowest in the mouse. Yeah, because it's about, for me, it's about how you differentiate your input.
Yes. I first noticed that discussing these issues with you, I switched to German. So my mouse is not in English, but in German.
See, that's your 95% of your mind. Yeah.
I have a second question, and then I switch to the questions from the audience. My second question was exactly on what you touched and what you described earlier as interactions of the input of stimulus with the breast stimulus activity. In functional systems theory, there is a very closely related point. First, one of the scientists in the School of Functional Systems Theory named what we are discussing now as stimulus stimulus reactionary paradigm. Because development of the functional systems theory was a kind of opposition and negation of stimulus-response properties of the nervous system, of reflexes, of conditioned reflexes and unconditioned reflexes in power school. And the idea was exactly what you said, that usually there is a image of the environment where there is a stimulus and there is nervous system where certain processes start to develop. What functional systems theory introduced is that before stimulus comes, there is a stage which is called afferent synthesis, where the inputs from motivations, memory, context,
brilliant. I love this.
in a reverberatory manner.
Fantastic, fantastic.
Are integrated. And it was called in functional systems theory the pre-stimulus integration. And what comes as a stimulus in Pavlovian or Descartes paradigm was called in the functional systems theory just a triggering stimulus.
Of course.
The idea is that the pre-stimulus integration absorbs the stimulus on its activity. So that closely matches what we're discussing. My question now, you said that consciousness is...
No, leave it. Sorry, I find that really it addresses a gap in my approach. It's really nice. I like that very much.
You said that consciousness is possible only when there is an integration of incoming stimulus with the inner state pre-stimulus activity. Now imagine we do not have stimulus at all. Therefore, I mentioned stimulus reactionary paradigm. You have closed eye resting state activity of the flow of activity in dreams, in resting state, where no definite environmental stimuli are coming. What then is triggering the consciousness in this case?
It's a very good question. I really love this. First, let me just comment on this one, because I would really like to know more about this one. Because I mentioned this one here, you see this, which I put into this figure again. My problem is, and that seems to close the gap here, I didn't really, no, where is he? Here, sorry. So what you saw, for instance, I didn't really characterize this one in psychological terms. Yeah, I didn't, and that's a weakness. And my feeling is this could help me. And my guess that physiologically, this is your degree of phase synchronization.
Yes.
Yeah, very basic phase synchronization.
There were experiments in 50s and 60s on phase synchronization during these stages of reference.
Interesting. So now, the interesting thing, what we observe in schizophrenia, we observe, let's say, after stimulus onset, a decrease in phase coherence, intertrial phase coherence in EEG. They cannot synchronize with the stimulus. But the more interesting thing that already in the pre-stimulus, we observe a decrease in the synchronization. Yeah, of course, then you can say it's prediction, yeah, but what on earth is prediction? It's this one. I really like this. I would like to know more about this. Because that gives me the link from the pre-stimulus to the psychological level, yeah, which I'm completely missing. I'm very weak on the psychological side. So, and now your question, sorry.
About consciousness as a condition
Okay. Okay. So why do you have consciousness in the resting state? Yeah, so now you see, I see. So now, of course, you can say I'm committing a pocket, as we say in Germany, a pocket gambler trick. But so for me, the notion of input and stimulus, I use them in a very wide sense. You see that also in our review paper. So for me, it's not stimulus input, it's not just the external input from the environment, but because you have, even in the resting state, you have a continuous input from your body. We have all this research on brain-heart synchronization. Now I have a guy who does brain respiration synchronization in the infraslow range. So you have continuously bodily input, this alignment. And also, come on, even in sleep, as I said, you have still auditory input, and if the auditory input becomes strong, you can wake up, meaning you still process it. You process it maybe subliminally, but it impacts your dreams. So, and then also you have, in my Unlocking the Brain, I speak of a third type of input. Let's say if you have large neuronal fluctuations in your resting state, the brain might process that as is an internal input. So I speak often as if stimulus induced activity.
That kind of answer. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's dynamically at least feasible, yeah?
Now, more questions, please. Could you pass the microphone to the next?
Yeah. So you had a good prediction.
I will follow your answer. It seems it's really a trick, because if you interpret a stimulus as internal stimulus one, then you have no spontaneous activity in your definition, like in physiological terms, like activities that connected with no stimulus at all. So the problem is how you can make alignment if you what is different between spontaneous alignment and internal flow of internal stimulus.
Yeah, so
I
you
had exactly the same argument when I was starting to ask, but I politely didn't ask it. If your pre-stimulus integration states are states, then the internal stimuli as a fluctuation of the internal dynamics contributes and belongs to this pre-stimulus states, but not the stimulus. So how you differentiate the pre-stimulus integration with something arising within this integration, but considered to be a push causal stimulus?
So my first remark is, of course, more of a joke. With the spontaneous activity, your definition is more Catholic than the Pope, as we say in Germany. Yeah? No, so it's more your definition. You have a very pure definition of spontaneous activity without any input, and that's more Catholic than the Pope, as we would say. Yeah. So no, for me, the spontaneous activity is in a way, it's a misnomer. Yeah, because you have just look at the data. You have continuous input. And what the external stimulus does is just, first let me start different. You have all the kinds of external oriented cognition functions. You have also internally oriented. You have perception, you have cognition, you have attention, internally, externally oriented, blah, 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 blah. Yeah? And when you tell me about this pre-stimulus synthesis, these are basically seemingly all internally oriented functions, which also occur externally oriented. So meaning, the distinction between, let's say, spontaneous pre-stimulus and stimulus-induced activity is relative in a very strong sense. Yeah, it's ultimately probably the brain would smile. The brain, if you were asking the brain would sit here and say, "Come on, this is I just try to keep my balance." So then, of course, so for me. And you have, and exactly as you said, you have already consciousness when consciousness is continuously ongoing. Only, and that's what you see in these disorders of consciousness studies, only when your internal input recedes, you lose consciousness. You start losing consciousness. Yeah? You don't have fluctuations, everything becomes the same, and so on. So then, of course, the next question you might want to raise is then, how does the brain differentiate between internally oriented cognition and externally oriented cognition? And that's a very fair question, because it's no doubt so the degree of rest or pre-stimulus task difference might indicate the difference, is it more internal or external? Now, and that's probably why this non-additivity is relevant, because the non-additivity gives you a larger difference of the stimulus when compared to the pre-stimulus. Yeah, remember the curves I showed you? They were not additive, they were non-additive. And you have a paradigmatic case where you have a confusion between internally, externally oriented cognition, namely schizophrenia. We had a paper this year on, I did this with Javier, with a postdoc in Spain, so where we showed that in schizophrenia across different measures, neuronal measures, in EEG and fMRI, they have decreased pre-stimulus task differences. So when we linked that, and that was a review about different, it doesn't matter the measure, they just could not change their task-evoked or stimulus-related activity relative to the pre-stim or resting state. So, and symptomatically, we assume that that is related to confusion between internally, externally oriented cognition, and that's exactly what you see. Yeah? They perceive an internal input in their auditory cortex as an external voice. We call it hallucination. Same with delusions. So you have here a blurring between the boundary of internally, externally oriented cognition. I hope that addresses some of your questions.
I have a different hypothesis answering to your question. Of course, it is only a hypothesis. We have what we phenomenally treat as a flow of consciousness.
As a what?
Flow of consciousness.
Flow, yeah. Okay, yeah. Okay.
Which to us looks like that. But if you would remember what Georg said about 95% of our mental domain, there is a huge iceberg of activities which are not conscious at the moment. They are global activities. They are, in a sense, psychological in terms that they reflect the systems of experience which were acquired during the evolution and life of the organism, but they are not above the threshold of consciousness. What might be, as an answer to your question, is that what we see here as a conscious episode 1 is actually the following. There is flow and integration of many aspects. And one of them reaches to the top. Now, for the next, it emerges if there is not an external particular stimulus interfering with this. It will emerge also from the background, but from the background of all these pre-stimulus internal states activity.
Nice.
So you have both. There is a huge amount of activity in the afferent synthesis. This integration, pre-stimulus integration, usually it is not consciously recognized. So there is a huge amount of this integration which determines what will happen, and there is a single episode or state of activity which reaches the level of consciousness and can be used first as a trigger to the next state, and second it is determined and absorbed by the brain integration, which is making 95% of what is active in our brain.
Very interesting model. So I mostly agree. only thing I would say, it is not a single time scale, but it's a sum total of these which shapes these. It's the only difference I would. Yeah. So I would say it's the general overlap of all these different time scale, and basically here, and the general overlap across time of all these time scale construct something like this, and that's what you experience. That's your stream of consciousness.
Absolutely.
Yeah? And that meaning, very important here, because you asked the robot question. So what you need in your robot is multiple layers of timescales. You need a deep learning system, but the current ones are without timescales. You need a variety of different timescales to achieve this one. Sorry.
You wanted to expand the question, or
it's another question, a very short one. Would you place your theory under one of the philosophical doctrine like materialism, dualism, dual aspect, monism, and so on?
So we smile because there were some people from the Center of Consciousness, and I threw all the analytical conceptual inventory at me, and I tried to barely escape. Yeah. So I don't want to. So it's neither dualism, monism, and all this applies. But I don't really want to go into detail about this. So clear is this stands square. So let me just make one remark. So this is an ontological question, basically, dualism, monism, blah, blah, blah. The key ontological move here is temporal spatial alignment, because your brain synchronizes with the environment / the world, and that brings in the question of existence and reality. And I would argue I develop a spatial temporal ontology, and the brain is part of that. Meaning there's a world-brain relation, and that's necessary for consciousness. So I don't need to assume the conceivability of mind based on which you ask the question, how is the mind related to the brain? With this question being the presupposition for your possibility of distinguishing monism versus dualism. But you can read more on my spontaneous, not my brain, the spontaneous, that's very funny, the spontaneous brain 2018, MIT, and you see various things on my website. So.
Do we have more questions? Marina, please.
Thank you for your lecture, it was very interesting. And so we are here to know how the brain is coding the information. So it's about the code of the brain. And brain is a complex structure. It's a complex dynamic structure. And so we somehow affect it. And so there are some changes in its dynamic, in its structure maybe. And we can, find some predictors for this change and decode what was the effect. Mm-hmm. So there is some effect, it codes somehow in the brain structure and dynamics. We have a way to decode it. So the question is, can a brain and its structures itself decode the information in these temporal-spatial dynamics? So it's maybe, the problem for me is that your studies are observational. So we have a correlation with some process, and its temporal-spatial dynamics in brain changed in them. But it may be, we can decode some information about human behavior, brain thoughts, just using electromyography. So it doesn't mean that the change in maybe my mimic muscles, dynamics, they code something for my brain. So it's like, fMRI. We have changes in blood supply for some regions, and we can use this information to decode that this region are active, etc. But they are just linked with the activity of neurons. The link is that there is change in glucose intake, etc. So do you know, and maybe you have some approach to test the hypothesis that this change, these dynamics, they mean something for the brain itself. So that this
so
the brain code for brain, it's like gene code.
So I like that question very much, particularly the last one you said. What does it mean for the brain itself? And that's my argument against the cognitive people. The cognitive people just consider the brain what it means for us, but not for the brain. So, and in that sense, and you might be shocked by that, I would not consider the brain to be primarily be an information processing device. I think that's an abstraction. It's imposed by us. For me, the brain, if you want to get the answer, is sort of a biological organ which tries to keep its internal homeostasis in the face of this continuous external perturbation. So it's typical dynamic systems theory, what I'm doing here. Yeah? And with that approach, for me, it's not does the brain decode, your question was, how does the brain decode the information it receives from the environment? I do not think that the brain works this way. The brain doesn't represent the information. This is one of my favorite or anti-favorite ones, this representation stuff. I mean, this is in philosophy of mind, has entered the whole neuroscience. It's a disaster. For me, the brain doesn't represent, it primarily doesn't process information. For me, what the brain does is trying to continuously match with the environment, keeping its own homeostasis. Let's say if I put a dynamic spin on the otherwise rather cognitive frisson, I would say it tries to minimize its free energy. But he means the free energy in a very cognitive information-based context. I would mean it in a temporal-spatial dynamic concept, meaning I want to align my timescales with you. So because that keeps me homeostatically stable. Yeah, one of my clever engineering, actually the first author of this review paper measured Goloshoki, he always tried to shock me and our lab members with, all mental features are just an epiphenomenon. Yeah, but that would go with that. Yeah, so for me, that's why for me the encoding is much more relevant. And that I say it's a code. And for me, and I think I indicated that, in the 2014 book, I spoke about difference-based coding. What the brain encodes is the relative difference between different inputs. Yeah, and so this one can only arise out of this one if it encodes the difference between these two guys. Yeah, if it were encode each time scale by itself, it could not produce something like that. So difference-based coding is for me probably the basic code of the brain. I know it's a very daring assumption, but and often the way the data are analyzed are stimulus-based coding, because if you analyze your data in terms of discrete time points and then you just then you never get this one. You will never get there because it's a wrong analysis, and that's what they do all the time.
More questions? Can you pass the microphone? Yes, down. Thank you.
I need to stay in the camera.
George, I have two questions. First, maybe easy one, on education. Second one is the fractal scale stuff that we discussed before. So, education, suppose you have a bad student, rather not very talented, let's say, right? For whatever reasons, just not good genes or something. And you have bright person, right? And you have a couple of them. You educate first pair, or pattern good, right? And not educate first pair, it's a second pair. So basically, education, do you think that you might see different temporal spectrum, let's say, you know, for education if it matters, I suppose you do. It's like, okay, a person with education can have more global thinking, whatever, suppose, right? Now, and I guess for a person who is not very happy about having bad genes, you might have more concrete thinking, and no matter how you educate, it still be the same sort of temporal skills. How you would differentiate them?
Yeah, so good question for the education. So I was approached a couple of years ago by the didactic pedagogy people. And of course I said, okay, we do this. So what we did, there were chemistry people originally. So we presented complex chemical formula, dynamic, how they change all these atoms, and then they had to recognize which is the right one. Yeah. So I went back into chemistry in my older age. Yeah, it was very funny. And and then we investigated, of course, we did this doing EEG and resting state, and we had behavioral parameters for the learning effects and everything. And interestingly, the degree of scale-free activity of your rest and rest task modulation predicted your learning effects. So, and what do you do in these chemical formula? You have different time scales, the atom flies, and it's a dynamic thing, and that related to your different time scales in the brain. We could not do a direct matching between the input thing. So, and I would argue, probably you have inter-individual differences, and that's well known in your slope of your power spectrum, the power law exponent, and I can show you other data in the public talk. I think I will show this. You have really huge inter-individual differences which are not noise. And depending upon, let's say, if I have strong power in the slow frequency and less power in the faster frequency, I may not be good in fast learning tasks in those frequencies, whereas I may be good in slower tasks. If I have more in faster relative to slower, maybe I'm better in the faster learning task. You see here nicely how external, internal fits.
How you decouple learning capacities, giftedness or whatever, from education, which gives you again power of having more global scale?
I didn't get the which differentiate. What?
Like you gave an example for learning capacities, like giftedness or whatever you want to call, like learning capacities, learning abilities, right? You're saying, oh, we predicted learning.
Yeah, but what was the other one?
The other one is education, basically. If you educate a person, and if he's capable of education, of course, you would give them more power to see more global scale. Right?
I would say I would look at the resting state. I would do different challenge paradigms. How is the responsivity of the resting state? What is the repertoire of your resting? No. What is the repertoire of your resting state? To the degree to which you can change your PLE under external stimulation and stimulation with different time scales. And if you can differentiate different input scenarios, you might have a good predictor for learning effects later.
Yeah, and second question related to, remember, our discussion is about Walter Freeman, about theoretical practice and analysis. So if you have multi-scale analysis, etc., immediately comes to the question, do you plan to play with fractal analysis?
Yeah. See, what Walter Freeman, particularly what's his name, Scott Kelso does, so what I do, you see, I apply measures on sort of a mesoscopic layer, on a mesoscopic scale, ACW, PLE, median frequency, and spatial topography, and so on. Now, if you go one level more abstract, then you look for attractors and trajectories and things like that. And indeed, that's what, for instance, Scott Kelso does, what also Walter Freeman did. That should probably one level. Why don't I do that? Because I think if you really want to have a fine-grained mental resolution based on neuronal measures, I need to go into this mesoscopic level. I think that just have you the attractors might not be sufficient. But also, I'm not an expert there, so physicists or the person who sits beside you might heavily contradict me. So that's, I would say, but that's sort of the reason why I don't go to this macroscopic layer of dynamic system, but I stay with this mesoscopic layer.
Can I just ask a quick question? My question is probably more clinical. I have a patient who is depressed, completely insensitive to stimulus, or indifferent, I mean, to use the word. I cannot give him medication because he's not eating and drinking. Obviously, as you probably know, there's no injectable antidepressant medication. There's a contradiction for ECT, which I suppose I could use. From your knowledge of consciousness, for me, arises, she lies in bed. Is there any little advice that you could give to perhaps get them a bit more conscious, or at least a bit more motivated, as I know motivation would be part of the increased stimulus?
That's of course a difficult for us. The first thing I would have thought, of course, ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, if that is a contraindication. Then I would probably try some transcranial magnetic stimulation, high frequency, and I would try it in different regions. I know it's usually done in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. We have papers where we showed it in visual cortex and motor cortex to be effective. And then, of course, I would also think about ketamine, particularly good in suicidal patients. You can also think about amantadine. And that's what sort of spontaneously came to my mind. For the rest of the group, which is very interesting, we have a large, and I will present it on Saturday. So in depression, you're really literally too slow. Yeah, you don't react to external input. Things are too fast. And the external is too fast. Yeah? Why? Because your internal is too slow. Because you perceive the external relative to your internal. Yeah? So outer time speed, inner time speed. And what we did is that we now measured the time speed on the neuronal level. We operationalized in terms of neuronal variability changes. Yeah? If you have high variability, you have a lot of change, you have a lot of time speed. If you have not much neuronal variability change, you have less.
How did you measure empirically in this case?
Yeah, by neuronal variability. Dynamic so how much the amplitude of the signal changes across time.
But in animals or in
No, in humans. Real human depressed
people.
people.
What was the recording?
What there?
What was the recording? How did you?
fMRI. We did this in fMRI.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and indeed, so the working hypothesis we have for depression, that your neuronal activity is shifted towards the slower frequencies, and indeed we can support that, and that with that you also have a topographic shift from sensory reasons to default mode network. And that explains many symptoms, and that probably this patient's extreme cases, your activity is so slow that they experience no change anymore. There's no stream anymore. Yeah, they don't have this. They just have one big line and nothing changes anymore. So everything is stalled, literally, in the neuronal activity and then also in the experience. Yeah, and that, of course, then it becomes really dangerous. Yeah, but that's what I would do. I would try the TMS. One can try that in different regions. In particular, probably before I would even try ketamine.
Perhaps the final question, because we are working exactly 2 hours now. Please.
Another quick question. So, when the global functioning, there is a global functioning, and then there is.
Hard for me to understand.
Yeah. There is a global functioning, and then the localized representations, and I assume they are bidirectional. How does that translate to like memory, for example? That would be one question. And the other question: do you see the fact that there are 2 hemispheres, do they play a role in the formation of space specifically?
So the first question is about memory, second question is about space?
And having 2 hemispheres.
2 hemispheres.
Yeah, okay. So memory, my assumption is clear. Let's say if you have too slow activity in the hippocampus, you only retrieve contents in that frequency range.
In that domain, yes.
Yeah, so, and I can support that by, indirectly, of course, by patients with depression and mania. They have different kinds of contents they retrieve in their memory. Yeah, and one is too fast, the other one is too slow. But that's very tentative. Yeah, so that's basically when I say, look, my temporal dynamics structures my cognitive functions / my memory. And how it structures the kind of content you retrieve or the kind of content you focus on in your attention. That's a very daring hypothesis which we need to show, I know. But I think that's, so in that spatial temporal neuroscience for me. The second question was what again? Sorry, my...
2 hemispheres.
2 hemispheres. Yeah. See, wrong question, right question to the wrong person. So you see, I started out as a person with cortical midline structures, sense of self, and they always ask me in the reviews, is there a difference between right and left cortical midline structures as a core of the default model? Couldn't find any right-left differences. Sure they are, I cannot say much, particularly not in terms of spatial topography or temporal dynamic. I cannot say anything there because I'm not an expert. Of course there are differences, I know all that, the cognitive perceptual stuff, linguistic, non-linguistic and blah, blah, blah. I cannot, whether that is related to a differential temporal dynamic or global signal representation, right and left. I don't know. Never looked for that. Because I'm a globalist, yeah. So I look for the whole.
Despite absence of an answer to this last question, we had tremendous amount of things to learn from you, Georg. Thank you so much. It was an excellent and very inspiring, I think, for all of us, discussion in your seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Можно продолжить в субботу. Фундаментальная библиотека МГУ. 12:15.